So firstly, thank you very much for welcoming me to present today. I can see a couple of people from Australia, so that's very, given it's very early here in the morning, it's lovely to see you here, and also appreciate everyone who's come to hear the presentation today. So I'm going to be talking about the Loong Conservation Project, and he is what we know as the oldest imperial processional dragon in the world. We all think he's rather special. So I'm going to start with letting you know where I am, and I live very close to the confluence of a river and a creek, and I walk on this country almost every day and actually swim in this river many days. The land I'm presenting on are the unceded Kulin land of Naarm, which is Melbourne in Victoria, Australia. I'm going to commence with an acknowledgement of country, and this is how Australians begin an event or a presentation. It is the way we acknowledge and pay respect to First Nations people as the traditional owners and ongoing custodians of the land. I acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands on which I am on today for today's talk, and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Indigenous Australians and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of Australia. Oops. The late objects conservator and assistant professor Bruno Poulon from Winterthur, the University of Delaware, visited Australia in 2008, and I took copious notes of all that he shared on working with other cultures. And he said, "You can't speak to a crowd without them knowing a little about you." And so I wanted to share with you some of my experiences which have influenced and changed my conservation approaches. And so here you can see some of the places and people I have been lucky to work with. And you can see that I've worked in Syria, Singapore, Papua New Guinea, Georgia, Turkey and Italy, which aren't pictured. But I feel very privileged to have worked in these places, and they've definitely each shifted and changed the way I think and how I approach the things that I work on. So let's get on to what we're here for today, which is Loong. And who is he? What is he? And why do I say who is Loong? So Loong is a processional dragon. In fact, Loong means dragon. And he's an imperial processional dragon because he has 5 toes. He's over 120 years old and is the oldest surviving complete processional dragon in the world. He was 60 metres long when he arrived in Australia, but his processional life and past repairs have shortened him to 40 metres long. He is known as a living entity, and he belongs to the Bendigo Chinese Association. Loong is constructed from silk, cotton, bamboo, paper, feathers, mirrors, cardboard, brass, lacquer. And you can see here some of the elements. His head has a bamboo structure and is silk, paper, kingfisher, feathers, lacquer, mirrors, silk, pom-poms and paint. His body structure, so that's inside the head. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse pointing, but in the centre, you've got his head and the inside structure. You can see bells and things hanging inside as well. His body structure and carrying poles are bamboo, which you can see in the bottom left, and his body covering is silk, cotton, cardboard and glass. It's got wooden beads, tassels and paint. And originally, he had fur attached to the scales. So why and how did Loong come to Australia and Bendigo in Australia? In the 1850s, the gold rush brought people from all over the world to Australia, so much so that within 20 years, Australia's population had tripled from 40,000 to 1.7 million. And Bendigo was a gold rush boom town and became Australia's largest 19th century gold mining economy. Many Chinese made their way to Bendigo. Bendigo is a 2-hour drive from Melbourne, 150 kilometres, which is 93 miles northwest of Melbourne, which is the state's capital. And when this happened, Australia became a multicultural country. He was commissioned by the Bendigo Chinese Easter Fair Company for processional use. He was made in around 1890 in the Sing Chung workshop in Foshan on the Pearl River near Guangzhou, which is the photo in the top left in southern China. Loong made the long journey to Australia by sea and travelled from Melbourne to Bendigo by train. He's not the first dragon. that the Bendigo Chinese Association had. There were ones that preceded him, but he's the one that survives. And the first record of a dragon being paraded in Bendigo is 1892. Loong performed from 1901 to 1970, and his earliest appearance was at the Bendigo Easter procession. The Easter procession in Bendigo continues to this day. So it's a procession that raises money for children's hospitals, and it was a way that the Chinese community could show their culture, the extraordinary textiles, because it wasn't just Loong that came to Australia. At the time, it was all the costumes that went with Loong, so ceremonial dress and shoes and hats and collars. And it enabled them to show Australia at that time who they were and what they valued, and enabled them to give to the Bendigo community. Loong is awakened with a blessing ceremony, or he was awakened before he performed. He's still awakened when the other dragons in the museum that he's in perform. He's woken, and the other dragons, from their slumbers by sprinkling water using pomelo leaves. And the pomelo tree grew in Bendigo from seeds imported from China. The leaves from this tree are used to feed Loong and the other dragons at the Golden Dragon Museum at the Awakening Blessing ceremony 1 week before their performance, and the dried leaves sit in his mouth all year. One of the famous pictures of him being performed is here on the screen, and that was in 1901 when he travelled from Melbourne from Bendigo to Melbourne. And given it was 1901, it would have been much longer than the 2 hours it takes us to drive now. And I looked up how long it would take to walk, and it's at least 30 hours. And most probably he came by train, which would have been at least a few hours at that time, not to mention the numerous boxes he would have been in and the people that came with him to enable the parade. So this performance, or this procession, was in 1901, and it was to welcome the English Duke and Duchess of York, who were there for the opening of the first Australian Parliament. Through the early 1900s, Loong paraded at charitable events, raising money for local hospitals, including in Darwin at the top of Australia, Echuca, Adelaide and Sydney, and those all happened in the sort of 1920s and into the 30s. He raised money for the sick, and he won the hearts of many, and he came to symbolise community, benevolence, diversity and cultural acceptance. After almost 70 years of performing, Loong retired, and he was put away in the large wooden boxes that he arrived in. In March 1991, he went on display at the Golden Dragon Museum, and except for a couple of appearances, he has been on constant display ever since. Over time, Loong has been well supported with isolated work to prepare him for parades and to stabilise deterioration and repair accidental damage. His continued survival and overall good condition is a testament to the care and attention of the Bendigo Chinese community. We're not the first, the Grimwade Conservation Services group, to do the conservation work on him. Betty Luke, who's in this picture here, and the black and white one in the left-hand corner, as a textile conservator, and she worked on him in the 1980s, and this picture shows her working on in the 1990s. In 2000, the community received a $25,000 grant to prepare Loong for a parade during the centenary of Federation, so that's the 100 years after the Duke and Duchess appearance that Loong made, and these works were conducted by volunteers from the Bendigo Chinese Association and non-Bendigo Chinese Association members. At this time, Loong would have shrunk probably from his 60 metres down to 40 metres, and there's evidence all over him of repairs. And we really believe that if these repairs hadn't happened, Loong wouldn't still be on display now. The tools and things used, or the materials used, are very much domestic ones. So things like cardboard, we can see evidence of Kellogg's cardboard underneath some of his cardboard scales, brown packing tape, super glue, some very stiff adhesives on his skirt, house paint and things like that. Into the 2000s, a local conservator, Jude Shahinga, started doing work on him, but it was isolated and it was little bits at a time as money could be found for conservation work on him. So when we commenced our project, we did very detailed reporting, documentation and research to ascertain his past performance life, his past repair life, and his past conservation life. And that work was done initially with one of our students, a student called Jingwen, who was based in China due to the lockdowns that we all had all over the world. And she did that remotely with one of my team members, Marissa. And they did lots of Zoom meetings and discussions and enabled her to be able to do the report. And then we were able to look at it closely with Loong. So this all meant that when we came to conserve Loong, we had to make very careful considerations as to what past repairs to retain and which ones not to retain. In 2007, something very important happened, and that is that Loong was listed on the Victorian Heritage Register. This meant he was recognised for his historical and cultural significance to the state of Victoria, which made him eligible for a living heritage grant. And that was done by the then CEO of the museum, Anita Jack, which enabled us in 2021 to apply with the Golden Dragon Museum for a living heritage grant. And towards the end of 2021, we were, as the Golden Dragon Museum, working with us, a $133,000 living heritage grant from the Victorian Government, Heritage Victoria, for conservation work. So then we were able to have the Loong Conservation Project. So from the previous images, especially the old ones, you can see that Loong, in his performing life, was subjected to physical stress. He has signs of oxidation and embrittlement, rips, tears, cracks and holes caused by ageing and activity. And although Loong had repairs and conservation before we started, his size and weight made it challenging to advance complex or extensive conservation works, and as such, his deterioration was accelerating. The Loong Conservation Project enabled a large team of conservators, students, and Chinese community volunteers to work concurrently to stabilise and repair the damage. We commenced the project in September 2021 while Melbourne was in COVID lockdown, and we completed the conservation project in July 2022. So here's some project figures. We had 13 sprints to Bendigo. So as I said, Bendigo is 2 hours drive from Melbourne. So that made it impossible or very tiring to attempt to do this drive daily. So we actually went and stayed up there typically for 3 nights at a time. And I had a team of 12 conservators, 6 students, and over the project, 41 Bendigo Chinese Association members. It took a huge number of hours to do the project. In total, it was 2,375 hours of work. This was 1,500 hours of treatment and another 858 hours of research and admin and permit approvals, not forgetting the car driving as well. And what's important to note is that every single conservation step that we took on Loong had to have permission from Heritage Victoria. So everything that we foresaw, or I foresaw Loong needing in conservation, required a request, which meant that we documented the problem, documented how we intended to do a repair, tested the repair, and then documented that. A document then went to Heritage Victoria. They then most of the time approved it, but sometimes they didn't approve it. And then we had to come back with arguments if we felt it was worth arguing for that particular step or that particular conservation material to be used. We commenced all conservation visits to Loong by greeting him. And so what that meant was, as the team leader, I introduced each new team member to Loong, and I explained to Loong what we were going to do on the sprint. So that would be something like, hello Loong, we've come from Melbourne. we're going to assist in making you last longer and look beautiful. And when we did the cleaning, for example, I said, we're going to make you shine much more brightly and make you sparkle. And then I'd say, when we had a new student join us, I'd say, this is Isabel. Isabel's training to be a conservator. She's working with us very closely. And Isabel's worked in China and speaks Mandarin, or something like that. So each time we introduced ourselves so that we were respecting Loong as a living entity. So we commenced with a very detailed examination of Loong, and as I said, we looked at his past restoration and conservation. And you can see here, obviously, this was very early in the project when we had to actually get permission to drive outside of Melbourne. I think it was probably, we might have been in past the 10-kilometre radius that we're allowed to be in, but at this stage we had to get approval from the university and from the government to travel further distances. So we commenced with actually painting the wooden stands that sit under Loong, and there's 22 stands, and these support 22 bamboo poles, which were used to carry Loong. And these poles are bamboo, and a lot of them were split. And in consultation with the Golden Dragon Museum and the Bendigo Chinese Association, the colour red was chosen to replace the colour green, which the stands were. The bamboo poles were under some tension due to the stand having holes that were quite large, and the immense weight of Loong and the fabric and the cardboard and the huge stretch of him. So my team member Dr. Evan Tyndall, applied his PhD research and measured the internal diameter of the poles and created a sleeve that goes inside, and those sleeves have been inserted into the stands and have a mylar barrier in between. Evan looked at 3D printing material and how its longevity in terms of conservation. So he chose a material called Fiberflex. We used, for the bamboo supports, so these are the supports that we used originally to carry Loong and now he stands on, we used fish glue, Japanese tissue paper coloured with golden acrylics, and these were inserted into the cracks. And you'll see in the images, these images are more, Loong was done entirely within a gallery, and that meant finding ways to be comfortable around Loong. So this meant sometimes we were lying on the floor. I'm lying on the floor on a mat here. It means sometimes we're wearing knee pads. We stood on ladders, platforms. We all had to have heights training to stand over a certain height. We took breaks because of the tension that standing for long periods of time took. And we had lists of exercises that we had for everyone to take. And part of my role was to make sure that everyone took a break. We took breaks for morning tea and afternoon tea, and we lay down on the carpet slightly out of sight of museum visitors to take breaks and stretch our backs out and do stretches while we did the project. Loong was very dusty. And we spent the first weekend we were there. We did it on a weekend so we could work with the community, brush vacuum him using very soft brushes. And you can see in the mirror on Loong's head and on his tongue the difference that the cleaning made. And just to point out too, you can see leaves inside Loong's mouth, and that's the pomelo leaves that I was talking about before. So they were fresh at the Easter parade, which would have been around April of 2022. And by this stage, we were in December 2022. So they sat there for that period, and then they were renewed last Easter. So here we are cleaning Loong with the Bendigo Chinese Association, and the project has been very collaborative with the community, very collaborative with the museum. And you can see that we are all happy. I have to say it was a very happy project. I think everyone just feels very happy working with Loong. We could see the difference we were making, and being able to work and see a difference and hear that we were making a difference meant a lot. So often we don't get to see the reaction of people. And here the reaction was evident as we worked side by side, and so was the gratitude that people felt, and also the stories we heard. So many people, either who were in the museum visiting or working with us, were able to tell us stories about Loong, stories about when they first saw him, or stories about their great-grandfather who had carried him. And they made the project extremely rich, and we really felt that we were really part of Loong's ongoing life. So, conserving his dragon scales, there's 1,376 scales, which meant that we looked in detail at every single scale and conserved in some way every scale, and looked at them more than once. It would be, each one would have been looked over at least 4 or 5 times by the team. So most scales required repair to the delaminating scalloped edges, so the cardboard base that the scale is on, to the decals, which are the paper that's sitting on top of the yellow silk, and loose mirrors. So had mirrors all over these scales. And we use starch paste to adhere the decals down, and we used Fenori, 1% Fenori, to adhere the to assist in preventing the protruding cotton feel from coming out, which we did by using tinted Japanese tissue paper, tinted with golden acrylic paint. And the scales, the pink colour is different all over Loong because the light hitting him has been differential throughout his display rather than his processional life. So there's areas where the pink colour is very bright. It would have been almost fluorescent pink when he first came out to perform, and now it's pale pinks and orangey pinks and reddy pinks, and in some places in the community repairs we think the pink has been painted over and it's quite orange. So it meant that there was numerous different shades of pink that we made to do those repairs. So this is an example in the top bottom picture where we've put Japanese tissue paper over it to assist in holding it down. Fenori was one of the ones we had to make an argument for with Heritage Victoria. They wanted us to use starch paste, and we felt Fenori would be a much better material, and I'll talk a little bit more why we chose Fenori, other than we felt it was better for the silk in upcoming slides. Here you can see some of the conservation in action, the decals being adhered down. The starch paste we use is very, very much a paste-like consistency. For those that aren't conservators, like a toothpaste consistency, very thick. Throughout the body, you can see the magnets. We bought many magnets. These are plastic-covered ones with remay underneath to prevent the adhesive and the remay sticking to the magnets. And we'd had to wait for a certain number to dry and then come back and use them. So it was a constant swapping from one location to another. There's well over 19,000 mirrors, and these are the mirrors on the scales as well as mirrors that are along his skirt. And so these were also detaching, and so the ones on the skirt were stitched back on. The ones on the scales were adhered back on, and the brass cap that holds the mirror down was stitched down, and it was too much mechanical action to attempt to stitch it through the fabric, too much movement of the scale. It would cause something else to ping off. So these were adhered, and what we did was we used starch paste to encase little bits of worms of Japanese tissue paper, which was stuck to the brass and then stuck to the cardboard or the fabric underneath. There were many splits in the skirt, and you literally, as anyone who works on silk knows, silk of this age, you can touch and lift and a new split will form. So we did couching repairs on the skirt, and these were done by Dr. Rohani Mirabuta-Leiby, Jude Shahinga, who's the conservator that I was telling you that had been worked on Loong for many years. We engaged her to work on the project with us and learned immensely from Jude, and also another team member, Ellie, and they did many hours of stitching, as you can see, not the most comfortable position to be stitching in, sometimes sitting on stools, sometimes sitting on chairs, and we're all using headlamps and magnification to assist us in seeing. In fact, the best time to see Loong was when we did the repairs, is when we did some filming work, and then he was under super duper wonderful bright lights, which helped us to see. We also reversed old repairs, and as I said before, we were careful in which ones we did and which ones we didn't. So these ones are on Loong's head, which are mirrors that had been painted over when there'd been overpaint put over his original decoration, silver paint. And so we removed that. This is when we were doing the tests for approval by Heritage Victoria. And there was very discoloured stitching on the side of his face or in his cheek. And it had a very sort of a Frankenstein look to it, because the threads would have been a lovely shade of pink matching Loong at the time of the decoration. And they had discoloured to a whitish colour. And when we pulled them out, they were half white and half pink. So these were taken out, and then the silk was adhered to the structure of Loong's face. We also raised his head, and we did this because his neck fabric was dragging on the floor, and we raised it twice actually. We raised it on the structure within this stand that he was on. We raised it there, and then we raised it again as well onto a podium. And by raising him, he was far more in keeping with his height that he would have been in performance, which was meant to be a bit scary and exciting, and to when he performed, his head would swoop into crowds and come over people, and crowds would swerve back as he swung around. So he's in a much more fitting position than he was in. But to do this, we had to have permission from Heritage Victoria as well. We also improved, or not didn't improve. We assisted the bamboo structure to not collapse between each bamboo support. And you can see in the middle picture where his back, his spine is collapsing. And by the way, this red fabric at the top is his spine, it's his life force. And then we actually used archival blue board, 3 triple gauged inside, and we slid it under, which meant, as we did quite a bit working inside his structure, and I was just the right height, and probably one of the best heights actually to do that on the inside. And so someone would be on the outside and I would be on the inside, putting it in so that it took the weight, and very carefully tucking it so that it didn't put strain on the fabric as well. So although you can see a cardboard tip here, these were typically bent down, which made it very usable. And we've left a large supply of cardboard with the Bendigo Chinese Association so that they can replace it into the future if any of these areas fail or sag over time. And we also, by lifting it, of course, then the skirt and beads then showed huge gapes. So these were simply lifted up. But one of the things we did was, there's been many times over the past, both in his processional life but also in his conservation life, that cotton tape has been used to hold different parts up on the inside. So we actually used legal tape, pink tape, real pink tape, pink cotton tape, to hold up the skirt on the inside. And we did this by bringing it inside and tying it to the different bamboo elements on the inside. And we did do oddie tests and dye tests to check that the cotton tape didn't run, in case that would be an issue with any, well, if there was a fire and the sprinklers went off in the gallery in the future. The front of Loong has a pearl and flame regalia, and you can just make them out in the black and white photo. These are used to tease the dragon as he performs. They precede him, and these were also came with Loong to Australia, and these ones we were able to bring back to our laboratory in Melbourne, and here's my team member Ellie Bernard working on that. And we used all the same materials we used on Loong, but we were able to do it within the lab. The last conservation thing, other than we also moved him at the end, but the last thing that I did when we left was make up a conservation kit to be left with the museum, so that Ju Chahinga or future conservators, if it's not us, can work on Loong. So this is a kit with the little sleeves to insert into his stand, fish glue in bottles, bamboo skewers, cotton tape, the pink legal tape, painted red Japanese tissue paper for the stands, and so forth. So a complete kit, including deionised water for the museum to use, because Loong will inevitably continue to deteriorate, and there'll be small bits of which we needed ongoing. Also part of the project was a maintenance plan, which we delivered to Heritage Victoria for the Golden Dragon Museum, which included cleaning him every 6 months and examining him for conservation. And we're very lucky that the collection manager, Megan Hall, is actually a conservator. So she is well adept to enable conservation to continue to occur on Loong into the future. So part of the project was doing a pilot study in conservation sustainability. And it's something that the Grimwade, and I'm sure many of you in the audience today do as conservators. How can we do things most sustainably? So we already have a whole lot of things that we do in our laboratory, and we've been accredited with Green Impact and different awards within Australia to work in a green and sustainable way. So this is directly outside my objects lab, and we have recycling bin for gloves and for cardboard and for plastic. We also have upcycling, where we put things that we can't recycle, and some of these things are taken to a local childcare centre. And we also reuse conservation packaging. So we thought, how can we apply these things to the project? So we piloted the project to examine our carbon footprint, and this was done by engaging climate consultants and examine the project. And we got them in at the very beginning of the project, so they looked at how we were acting. And then early in the project, we implemented reasonable changes to our methodology, to the materials that we were using, and the way that we were behaving, so our behavioural choices to reduce our carbon emissions. So they assessed our buildings, electricity, our water and waste, our transport and fuel, the accommodation we stayed in, our procurement. So that was, how far something had travelled as a conservation material to us, our conservation materials, our daily habits and behaviours, and our expenses controls. We also did a life cycle assessment of some key conservation materials. So this is what's known as cradle to grave. And what we looked at was we compared wheat starch, finori, and Japanese tissue. And what was found, and the reason that we, after Heritage Victoria said no to finori and yes to starch paste to repair the scales, that came in, I think, 2 days before a sprint to Bendigo, and I went, okay, then we have to change it to finori, which meant that we had to put in an argument to Heritage Victoria. And conservation isn't always dramatic, but it was a little bit dramatic because we put in the argument, and it had to go to someone to be assessed at Heritage Victoria. And it was while we were driving to Bendigo, we needed to stop on the side of the road. I needed to talk to my team member, Marissa, to continue the email chain, and receive permission, I think, literally on arrival to start doing the finori work. So we were very happy that we put in the effort for that to occur, because finori is something like 100 times, and I haven't got the numbers, that will come in the future. It's so much better than wheat starch paste. And when you think about it, it's for quite obvious reasons. Finori is seaweed based, it comes from the sea. Meaning a lot of things are happening naturally. Where wheat starch paste, there's a lot of things that make it occur into a paste, which includes the raw extraction of material. It includes watering. It includes how it's transported, as does finori. But finori, it's such a it's a product that you need so little of, and we were only using it 1%, which meant it went a really long distance as well. And we also looked at Japanese tissue as well, as you can see. So we also looked at how we could do be more sustainable in action. So our headlamps are rechargeable using a USB port rather than batteries. We refurbished the support stands using locally sourced paint. So all of our materials we could source locally in Bendigo, we did. We also worked with the Bendigo Woodworking Association to do the wooden plinths that we worked on, that went under Loong and within another little structure that went inside his head. We sorted and recycled all our waste before we came back to Melbourne, which meant we brought it back with us so that we could recycle it. And we upcycled soft plastics into tools. So we used the packaging that the headlamps were in to create the micro spatula to use in the scalloped edges of Loong during the conservation treatment. And I now have a lot of plastic in my drawer at work so that we can continue using this for spatulas. This gives an example of the granular approach, which was that we all had to give my manager, Penny Tripp, who was working with Pangolin Associates, who did the measuring of our carbon footprint, what our car, how far we travelled, what make and model it was, and they worked out the efficiency on that. So based on looking at how we all were using our cars, we changed it to catching the train. Oops. So they looked at how we used electricity, water and waste, and by far the biggest consumable products or products that impacted our carbon footprint was actually the museum itself, at the lighting and what it takes to run a museum. But while we were working, we switched off all lights and vacuum cleaners when not in use. We used rechargeable, reusable headlamps, and we sorted and appropriately recycled waste and upcycled soft plastics. We used carpooling for the person that carried the equipment up. And then we used the train and we did walking within Bendigo. I made my team a bit tired. So at the end of the day, we walked back to our accommodation, which was reasonably close. And then we walked to dinner and back, which also meant we chose close locations. We also chose accommodation based on sustainable practice and ones that had higher ratings for sustainability. We procured conservation treatment materials and supplies from local places in Bendigo. Upcycled materials and recycled, and our daily habits. And this was something that we found was something that we could change the most, which was what did we use, our walking and what we consumed. So we made it in the project that there'd be no consumption of red meats and dairy due to their high emission rates. The project won awards, and I think, Loong is magnificent, so why shouldn't he win awards? So the first award was the Australian Museum Galleries Award for Victoria for small organisations, which can be seen here proudly next to Loong. It's on display in the gallery. And we also won the Grimwade Conservation Services, won the 2022 Australian Institute for Conservation of Cultural Materials for Outstanding Treatment Award. We had a lot of public exposure. So you can see here we are in the gallery doing the conservation work. I talked to school groups as they came through, and the project had a lot of exposure throughout. At the commencement of the project, there was Loong appeared in print media when the Minister for Planning announced the Living Heritage Grant. And then at the end of the project, or during the project, we made a YouTube video, which has had, I actually haven't looked recently, but I think that with the small videos has had something like 2,000 hits so far. So the importance of being able to document a project like this enables a lot more people can learn about conservation and about Loong himself and the community who've looked after him all this time. At the completion of the project, myself and Lee McKinnon, who is the research officer at the Golden Dragon Museum, wrote an article for the University of Melbourne Pursuit, which is an online digital article. And then after that, we started getting some more media requests, which included a radio interview, which is about for 45 minutes, a BBC World appearance on the news, and digital stories in Mandarin and English for SBS, which is the multicultural and multilingual TV and radio stations in Australia. And there's a few more that are still on their way. But he's kept us, to say the least, very busy. Next weekend, we're having a community symposium where we're going to deliver back to the community what we've done working on Loong, and we're doing that in association with the Trove Art Institute, the Golden Dragon Museum, and fundings from Chinese Contemporary Studies at the University of Melbourne. So Loong's legacy. Loong has literally a son and a grandson at the Golden Dragon Museum, Son Loong and Daigom Loong. And so what we've done on Loong, the methods of how we've worked, the materials we've used, and working with community are all going to be used on these dragons in the future. There's been a community member for many years working on Sun Loong, and she's done a magnificent job, and we're going to look at just changing, or Megan's going to look at changing a few of the materials that are being used there to make him last longer. So a project like this doesn't happen without many, many people, and it's been an honour to present this talk on behalf of Loong and the many partners and groups involved. And thank you very much for your attention and your interest.